For some British Conservatives, it doesn't go far enough, and for others, it is clearly too hard. The planned new asylum law divides the Tories. And British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak escaped a historic defeat in Parliament in the dispute over his asylum policy. On Tuesday evening, the majority of MPs in the House of Commons voted in the second reading for a bill with which the Conservative government wants to save its asylum pact with Rwanda, which the Supreme Court declared unlawful. There had previously been great doubts as to whether Sunak could get the required majority behind him. Both the right and moderate wings of his party had major reservations about the proposed law. However, at the last minute, the government was able to convince ultra-conservative MPs not to vote against the draft by offering the prospect of concessions. In the end, 313 MPs voted for the bill and 269 against it. Otherwise, according to reports, it would have been the first time since 1986 that a bill had failed in the second reading, and Sunak might have faced political extinction. However, the dispute is unlikely to be settled with a vote just because they won. The Prime Minister was just buying time here, and according to media reports, almost 40 MPs from his own party abstained. If they turn against him, he would probably not achieve a majority. At the center of the dispute is the asylum pact with Rwanda. In order to deter migrants, London wants to send irregular arrivals to the East African country in the future without examining their asylum applications and regardless of their origin. Instead, they should seek protection there because there are no plans to return them to Great Britain. However, the British Supreme Court had raised concerns about the Rwandan asylum process and declared the plan unlawful in mid-November. In order to overcome this hurdle, the government in London now wants to declare Rwanda a safe third country by law and at the same time exclude legal recourse in Great Britain, citing human rights. The British people should decide who can come to this country, not criminal gangs or foreign courts. That's what this bill delivers. That's what Sunak wrote on X after the vote. And he wrote, "We will now make it law so we can start the flights to Rwanda and stop the boats." You know that slogan. Critics, including from his own party, accused Sunak of overriding the principles of the rule of law with the project. For others, the advance did not go far enough, and they demanded that the possibility of going to international courts be ruled out by law. Several right-wing groups within the Tory group announced shortly before the vote that they would abstain, though. However, they threatened to fail the bill's third reading in the new year if their demands were not met. The disputes were reminiscent of the chaotic Brexit period when then Prime Minister Theresa May failed several times with her Brexit deal in the House of Commons. On Tuesday morning, the Prime Minister invited people to breakfast in Downing Street, and around 20 leading representatives of the right wing of the Conservative Party appeared and listened to the Prime Minister's arguments as to why his version of the law, officially called Rwanda Security, is the only possible one. It is about this emergency law that is intended to ensure the deportation of refugees who have entered the kingdom illegally, and you know what's going to happen to them then. The bill declares Rwanda a safe third country and suspends part of British human rights law to make it more difficult for those affected to challenge their deportation in a British court. However, individual lawsuits in hardship cases and going to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg will still be possible. The bill was immediately met with bitter resistance, not just from the opposition, but even from parts of the government faction. The emergency law, as I said, did not go far enough for the right wing of the Conservatives, and the right wingers want the law to no longer have any loopholes and therefore expressly stipulate the suspension of international treaties such as the Refugee Convention and the Human Rights Convention. Home Secretary James Cleverly and Prime Minister Sunak rejected this because this step would damage Britain's international reputation and result in its exclusion from the Council of Europe, which would then put it in the company of Belarus and Russia. But for the conservative right, the sovereignty of the kingdom is more important. Robert Jenrick, who resigned as Minister of State for Migration in protest against the law, and Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary who was ousted because of her extreme position, they loudly demanded that the national interest must take precedence over international obligations, and they had around 100 MPs behind them. The similarly strong group of moderate conservatives, on the other hand, was just able to bring themselves to support the emergency law, although they have reservations about the suspension of the British Human Rights Act, and any further tightening that their right-wing colleagues are calling for would be met with vigorous resistance. That's at least what their spokesman Damien Green made clear. The issue divides the party like no other. It is as if the worst of Brexit times have returned, where the topic of national sovereignty versus international cooperation dominated the debates. And Sunak is in a dilemma. If he tightens his law, he alienates the moderates. If he doesn't, he loses support on the right-wing fringe. And Sunak, whose Tory party is trailing the opposition Labour Party in the polls, has made it a central priority to end the irregular entry of migrants in small boats across the English Channel. In 2022 alone, around 45,000 people came to Great Britain this way. And so far this year, the number is a third lower than last year. Nevertheless, the promise is not considered fulfilled. For the British Prime Minister, it is already a matter of election campaign. A new parliament must be elected by January 2025, and commentators expect a vote in autumn 2024 at the latest. The Tories see the tough action against irregular immigrants as an opportunity to attract Brexit supporters from the working class to hold the rod. And experts such as political scientist Matthew Flinders from the University of Sheffield speak of symbolic politics at high costs. So far, £240 million have already flowed to Rwanda, and a further 50 million are to be paid next year. But so far, not a single migrant has been transferred there. Parliament's Human Rights Committee warned the law breached international law and could lead to an unprecedented constitutional conflict between ministers and the British courts. Hardliners are even calling for the withdrawal from the European Conventions on Human Rights so that those affected can no longer turn to the European Court of Human Rights. But as I said, Sunak has so far rejected this. But if the Prime Minister changes course, he will be in real trouble. So the third reading will be the really interesting one here. But these Tories fear for the country's reputation if Britain ignores international human rights on the moderate side. And so Sunak is stuck between the fronts. The Prime Minister no longer has any cards in his hand, as Flinders, for example, said. And exactly 4 years to the day after their brilliant election victory in 2019, the Conservatives have now avoided a serious bankruptcy, but only for the time being. But it will likely remain uncomfortable. The first people are already demanding that the winner from back then take over the party again in order to prevent an election debacle, and his name is Boris Johnson. Yeah, that name is not gone yet. But if you want to see something else, the next video is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.